James Williams had repaired broken things his entire life. HVAC systems, electrical panels, plumbing that had given up decades ago. He understood how things failed and how to make them work again. He was 35 years old and had learned that most problems had solutions if you were patient enough to find them. This one didn't feel like it had a solution. This one felt like standing at the edge of something he'd spent 23 years trying not to think about. The elevator doors opened on the 16th floor of Hartwell Industries, and she was already inside. He'd been working in the building for 3 weeks, long enough to know the rhythm of the place. The people who nodded at him in the hallways, the security guard who waved him through every morning without checking his badge twice, long enough to have fixed half the ventilation system and rewired 2 floors worth of outdated electrical panels, not long enough to have seen the CEO. He'd heard the name Hartwell, the way you hear background noise in a place like this, constant, ubiquitous, not requiring attention. He knew there were Hartwell photographs in the lobby, a Hartwell plaque above the reception desk, Hartwell signatures on every policy document he'd initialed on his way in each day. Rich families put their names on things. That was how the world worked. She was dressed in charcoal gray, her dark hair pulled back, her posture carrying the kind of stillness that didn't come from relaxation. The 2 other people in the elevator had found places to look that weren't at her, not out of rudeness, but the way people instinctively created space around someone whose presence demanded it. James stepped in and pressed himself toward the back panel. He kept his eyes down the way he'd learned to do in places where he was hired to be invisible. Then he saw her hand. It was resting against the edge of a black leather portfolio, one finger hooked over the top. And there, on her little finger, was a ring that made every thought in his head collapse into a single airless moment. Not silver, not gold. Copper wire, twisted and hammered flat, darkened with age and wear, shaped by hands that hadn't known what they were doing, but had meant every second of the effort. James had cut his thumb twice making that ring. He still had the scar, a thin, pale line running just below the knuckle of his left hand. He was looking at it now without meaning to, his thumb pressing against the old wound as if it could tell him he was wrong about what he was seeing. The elevator doors opened on 18. She walked out without looking back. The doors slid shut, and James stood alone in a mirrored box, staring at his own reflection and trying to remember how to breathe. Her name came back to him in pieces. Not Hartwell, not CEO. The name that surfaced first was the one a girl had spoken quietly on a dark stairwell 23 years ago. The night a burst pipe flooded the east wing of Riverside Children's Home, and 2 kids ended up sitting together on the steps while the staff scrambled to move everyone to dry rooms. Sarah, he'd been 12, she'd been 10. The smallest, quietest person he'd ever sat next to, who told him in a voice barely louder than a whisper that she'd never owned anything that was just hers. He had gone to the maintenance closet after the staff stopped checking on them, found a spool of electrical wire someone had left behind, and spent an hour bending it into something that might pass for a ring. His hands had been clumsy. The wire had fought him. He'd bled onto the concrete floor and hadn't cared because it was the only thing he could think to do for a girl who had nothing. He had told her he would marry her one day. She had laughed, not unkindly, and slid the ring onto her finger. 3 months later, she was gone. A family had come for her. A good family, the staff said, with money and a big house and everything a child could want. That was all anyone told him. She had disappeared into a life he couldn't imagine, and he had stayed at Riverside for another 4 years, until he aged out and found work and learned how to survive in a world that didn't owe him anything. He got off on the next floor and sat on the edge of a utility cart in the service corridor. The logic didn't hold. Maybe it was a different ring, but he had made that ring himself. He knew the exact angle of the twist, the way the ends had been tucked under because he hadn't had the right tool to cut them clean. There was no other ring like it in the world. It had been made by one person for one person in a maintenance closet that didn't exist anymore, in a building that had been demolished 12 years ago. She was still wearing it. That wasn't the behavior of someone who had forgotten. You didn't forget things you carried for 23 years. You kept things because forgetting was the one option you refused to take. James gave himself 5 minutes to decide. The rational case was simple. He was a contract repairman. She was the CEO of a company that probably had a market value he couldn't calculate. The gap between those two things was structural, the kind of distance that didn't close no matter how much history you stacked on one side. But the other part of him kept circling back to one fact. She wore it every day, not hidden in a drawer somewhere, in front of board members and assistants and everyone else who passed through this building. She wore a ring made of bent copper wire by a 12-year-old with borrowed tools and bleeding hands. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice made every single morning. James understood systems. He understood the difference between something that had failed and something that was waiting. This wasn't broken. This was something that had been running for 23 years without anyone acknowledging it was still on. He decided to stay.
I swear it.
The rest of the day passed in the mechanical rhythm of work. He finished the ventilation repair on 16, filed the paperwork with Stephen Parker, the facilities manager who'd hired him through the contractor agency, and took the service elevator down at 5:15. He sat in his truck in the parking structure for 10 minutes before starting the engine. The copper ring he'd seen burned into his vision like he'd stared too long at something bright. Jacob was waiting on the front steps when James pulled into the driveway. 7 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a shirt with a cartoon character James didn't recognize, and holding a folder full of papers that were probably homework or permission slips or both. The neighbor who ran the after-school program waved from her porch 2 doors down. James waved back and unlocked the front door, letting Jacob run inside ahead of him. The house was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living room where most of their life happened. Angela had picked it out 6 months before Jacob was born, back when they thought they had time. Back when the doctors had said her treatment was working and maybe they'd caught it early enough, they'd been wrong. Jacob had been 3 when she died, old enough to remember her but not old enough to hold on to the details. James filled in the gaps when he could. Told him stories about her laugh, her terrible singing voice, the way she used to rearrange the furniture every few months because she liked change. He kept her picture on the mantel and made sure Jacob knew he was allowed to talk about her whenever he wanted. Tonight Jacob dumped his backpack on the couch and pulled out a drawing. Construction paper, crayons, the kind of art that elementary school teachers sent home in waves. This one showed a woman in a suit, dark hair, no smile, just a straight line for a mouth and 2 dots for eyes. James set his toolbox down by the door. "Who's that?" Jacob shrugged, already digging through the fridge for the juice box James had left for him that morning. "A lady I saw at the big building. When Mrs. Patterson took us on the field trip last week." James had forgotten about the field trip. Some kind of career day thing where they toured office buildings and learned about different jobs. He'd signed the permission slip without reading it, the way he signed most things that came home in Jacob's folder. "She looked sad," Jacob added, pulling the juice box free and jamming the straw through the foil. "Like you sometimes." James didn't know what to say to that. He started pulling things out of the fridge for dinner, chicken, vegetables, rice that was still good from 2 nights ago. Jacob climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs and watched him work, swinging his legs the way he always did when he had something on his mind but hadn't figured out how to say it yet. "You think people are sad for the same reasons?" Jacob asked after a minute. James rinsed the vegetables in the sink and reached for the cutting board. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Just wondering." Jacob took a long pull from the juice box, the straw making that hollow sucking sound when he hit the bottom. "Mrs. Patterson says some people hide it better than others." James looked at his son. 7 years old and already figuring out things James had taken decades to understand. Angela used to say Jacob had her eyes, and James's heart. She'd been right about the eyes, dark brown, too big for his face, the kind that saw more than you wanted them to. The heart part James was still trying to live up to. They ate dinner at the small table by the window. Jacob talked about school, about the kid in his class who'd brought a lizard for show and tell, about the math test on Friday. He wasn't worried about, because numbers made sense to him the way they'd always made sense to James. After dinner, James ran the bath while Jacob picked out pajamas and argued half-heartedly about brushing his teeth. The routine was the same every night. predictable, safe, the kind of structure that kept both of them moving forward when the weight of everything Angela had left behind threatened to pull them under. Jacob climbed into bed with a book he'd already read 3 times. James sat on the edge of the mattress and opened to the first page, even though they both knew the story by heart. "Dad?" Jacob's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant the question mattered. James set the book down. "Yeah, buddy? Can Mom see us?" It wasn't the first time Jacob had asked. It wouldn't be the last. James had stopped trying to give him answers that sounded certain, because certainty felt like lying, and Jacob deserved better than that. "I think so," James said. "I think she's watching, making sure we're okay." Jacob nodded, his fingers picking at the edge of the blanket. "You think she's happy we're okay?" James's throat tightened. "I think she's proud of you. Every single day." Jacob seemed to accept that. He settled back against the pillows and James read until his son's breathing evened out into sleep. He sat there for another 5 minutes, watching Jacob's chest rise and fall. The small bottle of heart medication on the nightstand, a reminder that okay was a relative term. The murmur had been there since birth congenital, the doctor said. Something Jacob would need to monitor his whole life, but probably wouldn't stop him from doing anything he wanted to do. Probably. James hated that word. Hated the uncertainty it carried, the way it left room for everything to go wrong without warning. He turned off the light and pulled the door halfway closed. In the living room, he sat on the couch and stared at nothing for a while, his mind circling back to the elevator, to the ring, to the girl who'd become someone he didn't recognize except for the one thing she'd kept. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it brought dreams of maintenance closets and copper wire and a 10-year-old girl saying thank you like he'd given her the world. The next morning, James was back at Hartwell Industries by 7:30. Stephen had added 3 more items to his work order: a faulty outlet on 14, a temperature control issue in the executive conference room on 20, and something about the HVAC system making a grinding noise that nobody could pinpoint. James started with the outlet. The problem was obvious once he opened the wall plate. Bad wiring, probably original to the building, the kind of thing that should have been replaced a decade ago. He had it fixed in 20 minutes. The conference room took longer. The thermostat was fine, but the airflow was all wrong, which meant crawling through the ceiling to check the ductwork. He found the blockage an hour later. Someone had shoved a stack of files into the return vent, probably trying to make space in a storage closet and forgetting physics existed. He pulled the files out, logged the repair, and moved on. By 11, he was on 18, tracking down the HVAC noise Stephen had mentioned. The mechanical room was at the far end of the floor, past a maze of hallways and locked doors that required a security clearance he didn't have. Stephen had given him a temporary key card that morning with instructions to return it before he left. James swiped it at the first door and stepped into a corridor that smelled like fresh paint and expensive carpet. He was halfway to the mechanical room when he saw her. Sarah Hartwell came around the corner, moving fast, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression locked in the kind of focus that meant whoever was on the other end of that call was getting information they probably didn't want to hear. She was 12 feet away when she looked up. For exactly 1 second, the controlled surface of her face cracked open into something raw and unmanaged. Shock, maybe. Recognition, definitely. Something else underneath that James couldn't name because it was gone too fast, the door swinging shut before he could see what was behind it. She looked back at her phone, altered her path by 3 feet, and walked past him without a word. James stood in the hallway holding a clipboard and a wrench and the absolute certainty that she had recognized him. That whatever had just happened in that 1 second of eye contact, it hadn't been accidental. She knew who he was. She had made a decision about what to do with that knowledge in under a second, which meant the decision had already been made long before she turned that corner. He picked his tools back up and kept walking. The mechanical room was right where Stephen said it would be, the HVAC unit making a sound like metal grinding against metal in a way that suggested something had come loose and was rattling around inside the housing. He shut the system down, opened the panel, and found a broken fan blade that had cracked off and was bouncing against the interior wall. 15-minute fix. He swapped out the blade, sealed the panel, and restarted the system. The grinding stopped. He logged the repair and headed back the way he'd come. The hallway was empty now. No Sarah. No phone call. No one to witness the fact that James stood there for a full minute, staring at the spot where she'd walked past him like he didn't exist. The pattern held over the next week. She never looked at him directly, but twice he caught her in peripheral moments, once through the glass wall of a conference room where her eyes tracked briefly to the hallway where he was working, and once in the lobby at the end of a day when she took the long route around the reception desk to avoid the path he was standing near. There was no reason to take the long route. The lobby wasn't crowded. She was creating distance deliberately, and the effort it took to maintain that distance told James everything he needed to know. Something in her was still conducting. She just refused to let it complete the circuit. He extended his contract. Stephen didn't ask questions, just added his name to the schedule for another month and handed him a stack of new work orders that would keep him busy well into November. It was Stephen indirectly who gave James the context he'd been missing. They were standing in the service corridor on 12, waiting for the freight elevator, when Stephen mentioned with the casual candor of a man who'd worked somewhere long enough to stop thinking of information as gossip that Miss Hartwell had been running the company since she was 28. Board gave her hell for it, Stephen said, checking his watch like he had somewhere else to be. Some of them didn't think she was the right fit. James kept his eyes on the elevator display. Why not? Stephen shrugged. Hartwell's a family business, has been for 60 years. Sarah's adopted. Old guard doesn't see that as the same thing. The elevator doors opened. Stephen stepped inside and held the door with one hand, waiting for James to follow. James didn't move. Adopted when? She was 10, I think. Parents died a couple years back. Car accident. Left her the whole operation. Stephen let the door start to close, then caught it again. You coming? James shook his head. I'll take the stairs. Stephen shrugged and let the door shut. James stood alone in the corridor and felt the pieces rearrange themselves into a shape that made sense in the worst possible way. Sarah hadn't just been changed by her life. She'd been compressed by it. Heated and bent and cooled into something functional and fixed. Built to survive in a world that had spent years telling her she didn't belong. She had survived. And survival had cost her the ability to want things without measuring them first against what they might take from her. He waited 4 more days before he went to her floor with a legitimate reason. The ventilation issue Stephen had flagged that morning was real temperature readings were off in 3 offices near the executive suite, which meant something in the ductwork wasn't distributing air the way it should. James took the back hallway to the mechanical access panel 3 doors from Sarah's office and was working on it when her office door opened and she stepped into the hall. She saw him immediately. This time, there was nowhere to redirect her path. James spoke before she could decide whether to say something or choose not to. There's a flagged ventilation issue on this floor. I'm not here for any other reason. Sarah looked at him with an expression that wasn't cold and wasn't anything warmer either. She was wearing navy today, her hair down instead of pulled back, and the ring was there on her left hand exactly where it had been every other time he'd seen her. I know why you're here. Mr. Williams. Her voice was measured, and even the voice of someone trained to speak in rooms where every word was listened to by people who wanted to use it against her. I also know what you think you saw. James set the clipboard down on the floor beside his toolbox. I don't think anything, ma'am. I know what I made. There isn't another one. She didn't deny it. That, more than anything, told him everything. After a moment she crossed her arms, not defensively, but the way a person does when they're organizing themselves, and said, We were children. You did something kind, and I kept it because I was 10 years old, and I didn't own anything. That's the whole story. James picked the clipboard back up. If that were the whole story, you would have left it in a drawer somewhere. You wouldn't be wearing it to board meetings. What I wear is not your business. No, ma'am, James agreed. It's not. I'm just saying I noticed the difference between something kept and something held on to. They don't look the same. Sarah was quiet for a moment that stretched in a direction neither of them named. Then she said with a flatness that had something deliberate underneath it, You want to know why I kept it. You think it means something about what I feel. But you're looking at a version of me that stopped existing a long time ago. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were doing something her jaw couldn't quite control. The Hartwells gave me a future. They also gave me a role, and there was never much room between the two. You don't grow up in that house and come out the other side believing in promises made in a hallway at midnight by people who were still small enough to believe in them. She went back into her office before he could answer. The door shut without a slam, a controlled sound, chosen, the kind of quiet that takes practice. James stood in the hallway and stared at the ventilation panel without seeing it. What she had said wasn't cruelty. It was a person describing the architecture they'd built around themselves, and the description was accurate enough that it had its own kind of pain inside it. She hadn't been protected by the Hartwells so much as shaped by them. Survival had cost her the ability to want things softly, and she was telling him that because she thought it would make him leave. He understood that better than she probably knew. He had just never expected to find it here, in this building, wearing the ring he'd made when he still thought promises were simple. The complications arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of Jacob standing in the lobby looking small and lost. James had been on 14 replacing a circuit breaker when his phone buzzed with a text from the neighbor who ran the after-school program. Mix-up with the schedule. Jacob at Hartwell. Sorry. James took the stairs down 2 at a time and found his son sitting on one of the leather benches near the reception desk, his backpack beside him and a drawing spread across his lap. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s named Claire, who'd been friendly to James since his first day, was keeping an eye on him from behind the desk, but she looked relieved when James appeared. "Hey, buddy." James crouched down in front of Jacob, checking him over the way he always did when something went off script. "You okay?" Jacob nodded. "Mrs. Patterson got the days mixed up. She said to wait here and you'd come get me." "I'm here now." James picked up the backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "You been waiting long?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Jacob held up the drawing. Same construction paper, same crayons, same woman in the suit. "I finished this one." James was about to respond when he caught movement near the elevators. Sarah Hartwell stepping out into the lobby, her assistant beside her talking into a phone. She was halfway across the marble floor when she saw Jacob. Her steps slowed. Her eyes went from the boy to James and back to the boy, and something in her expression shifted into a recognition that looked like it hurt. She didn't stop walking, didn't change direction, just kept moving toward the front doors like she had somewhere to be, and this was nothing more than a crowded lobby on a Thursday afternoon. But James saw the way her hand moved just slightly, almost imperceptibly to her little finger, to the ring, and then stilled. He also saw the man who'd been standing near the elevators, older, 50-something, wearing a suit that probably cost more than James's truck. The man's eyes moved from Jacob to Sarah to James, and the calculation that crossed his face was the kind James had learned to recognize in places where he didn't belong. This was someone taking note, someone deciding whether what he'd just seen mattered. The man smiled slightly and walked toward the elevators like nothing had happened. James stood up, Jacob's hand in his, and headed for the door. Claire waved from behind the desk. Jacob waved back. They made it to the truck without incident, but the feeling that something had shifted stayed with James all the way home. That night, after Jacob was asleep, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and tried to think through what happened next. The smart move was obvious. Finish the contract, take the paycheck, and walk away from whatever Sarah Hartwell had spent 23 years building around herself. She'd told him plainly what she'd chosen. The girl from Riverside was gone. The person left behind had learned to survive by not wanting things that could be taken from her, and James showing up with a ring she'd kept didn't change the fact that she'd already made her decision a long time ago. The smart move made sense. James had never been good at smart moves when they required him to stop caring about things that mattered. He pulled a small spool of copper wire from the junk drawer in the kitchen left over from a repair job 2 months ago and sat at the table bending it slowly the way he had at 12. The motion came back to his hands like muscle memory. Twist, hammer flat with the handle of a screwdriver, tuck the ends under because he still didn't have the right tool to cut them clean. The finished piece looked almost identical to the one he'd made 23 years ago. Rougher, maybe, less patient, but recognizable. He tucked it into his chest pocket. Not a plan. A starting position. A reminder that the distance between floors didn't change what was true, and what was true was that some things were worth holding on to, even when the person holding them had convinced themselves they weren't allowed to want them anymore. James went to bed just after midnight. He didn't sleep well. When he did, he dreamed of girls on stairwells and promises that took decades to keep. The man from the lobby had a name: Richard Ashford. James learned it 3 days after the incident with Jacob, when Stephen mentioned in passing that one of the board members had been asking questions about the contractors working in the building. "Routine stuff," Stephen said. "Nothing to worry about." But the way he said it suggested he didn't entirely believe his own reassurance. James kept working. The list of repairs never seemed to get shorter. Old buildings had a way of developing new problems faster than you could fix the existing ones. He rewired a section of lighting on 9, replaced a compressor in the walk-in freezer that supplied the executive dining room, and spent an entire afternoon tracking down a water leak that turned out to be coming from a decorative fountain someone had installed in the lobby 15 years ago, without bothering to waterproof the basin properly. The work was good, straightforward. Problems that had solutions you could see and measure and fix with your hands. The problem of Sarah Hartwell didn't have a solution. It had a shape James was still trying to understand, and every time he thought he'd figured it out, something shifted, and he had to start over. She was avoiding him. That much was obvious. But she was doing it in a way that required effort, which meant she was aware of him in a way that went beyond simple recognition. Twice more he caught her changing direction when she saw him in a hallway. Once she took the stairs instead of the elevator when he stepped into the car on 12. The avoidance was deliberate and careful and exhausting to maintain, and James didn't know whether that made him feel better or worse about the whole situation. Jacob had stopped asking about the lady in his drawing, but he'd started bringing it up in other ways. Questions about why some people looked sad all the time. Whether grown-ups could be lonely even if they had jobs and nice clothes and offices with windows. James answered as honestly as he could without lying, which meant admitting that yes, sometimes people were lonely even when they looked like they had everything. Jacob seemed to accept this, but he kept the drawing in his folder and added details to it whenever he had crayons available. A window behind the woman now, a desk, a small plant that hadn't been there before. The next complication came on a Wednesday morning when James arrived to find his key card wasn't working. He swiped it 3 times at the main entrance before the security guard, a different one than usual, younger, less familiar, came over and asked to see his credentials. James showed him the contractor badge and the work order from Stephen. The guard made a phone call, waited, then handed everything back and told James to wait in the lobby while they sorted it out. 20 minutes later, a woman from HR appeared. Mid-40s. Wearing a blazer that looked uncomfortable, carrying an iPad and an expression that suggested this conversation was going to be unpleasant for both of them. She introduced herself as Linda Chen and asked James to follow her to a small conference room off the main lobby. Inside, she pulled up a chair and gestured for James to sit. He did. She tapped at the iPad for a moment, then looked up with the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring but wasn't. "Mr. Williams, we're conducting a routine review of all contractor access in the building, part of our updated security protocol." James waited. He'd been through enough corporate processes to know when someone was building toward bad news. Your background check came back clean, obviously. No issues there. But we did notice that your current work order has you accessing floors that typically require a higher clearance level than what's standard for maintenance contractors. "Stephen gave me the assignments," James said. "I go where the work is." "Of course." Linda tapped the screen again. "And Stephen's very happy with your work. He's mentioned that several times. It's just that with the executive floors, we have to be more careful about who has access and when." James could see where this was heading. "You want me to stay off the upper floors?" "Not exactly." Linda set the iPad down and folded her hands on the table in a way that was probably meant to look professional but came across as defensive. "We're just asking that any work above floor 15 be scheduled in advance and accompanied by a facility supervisor. For security purposes." "Stephen's the facility supervisor." "Yes, but Stephen can't be everywhere at once. We have other staff who can coordinate." What she wasn't saying was louder than what she was. Someone had flagged him. Someone wanted him watched, or limited, or ideally removed from the building entirely, but couldn't find a legitimate reason to make it happen. So they were doing it this way, adding friction, creating barriers, making his job harder until it became easier to just walk away. James stood up. Is there anything else? Linda looked relieved that he wasn't arguing. That's all for now. Your key card should be updated with the new access parameters by this afternoon. Just check with Stephen before you head to any of the executive floors, and we'll make sure someone's available to accompany you. James left the conference room and found Stephen in the service corridor on 3, looking at a clipboard and frowning at whatever was written there. When James explained what had just happened, Stephen's frown deepened. That's not coming from me, he said. I didn't ask for any security review. I know someone's making noise upstairs. Stephen looked at James with something that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation. You piss off anybody important? James thought about Richard Ashford in the lobby, about the way the man's eyes had moved between Jacob and Sarah like he was solving an equation, not intentionally. Stephen sighed and made a note on the clipboard. I'll push back where I can. But if this is coming from the board level, there's not much I can do. James understood. He thanked Stephen and went back to work, sticking to the lower floors and the jobs that didn't require an escort. The restriction chafed, but arguing about it would only make things worse. Whoever was behind this wanted a reaction. Giving them one would play into whatever strategy they were running. That evening, Jacob had a checkup at the pediatric cardiology clinic across town. Routine, the kind of appointment they did every 6 months to make sure the heart murmur hadn't gotten worse. James picked him up from the after-school program at 4 and drove through traffic that was worse than usual because of construction on the highway. They made it to the clinic with 5 minutes to spare. The nurse took Jacob's vitals, blood pressure, good, heart rate elevated, but within normal range, oxygen levels, fine. Dr. Morrison came in 15 minutes later with Jacob's chart and a stethoscope that Jacob eyed suspiciously because he still hadn't gotten used to the cold metal against his chest. The exam was quick. Dr. Morrison listened to Jacob's heart from 3 different positions, asked him to take deep breaths, asked him if he'd had any episodes of dizziness or chest pain or unusual fatigue. Jacob answered honestly, no, and sometimes, but only when he ran too much at recess. Dr. Morrison smiled and ruffled Jacob's hair. Sounds like you're doing great, buddy. Keep taking your medicine and listening to your body. If something feels off, you tell your dad right away, okay? Jacob nodded. Dr. Morrison turned to James. Everything looks stable. No changes from the last visit. We'll see you again in 6 months unless something comes up before then. Relief settled over James like a weight lifting. 6 more months of okay. 6 more months of probably instead of definitely. He'd take it. On the drive home, Jacob was quiet, looking out the window at the streetlights starting to flicker on as dusk settled over the city. James let the silence sit. Sometimes Jacob needed space to process things, especially after doctor visits that reminded him he wasn't quite the same as the other kids in his class. Finally, Jacob spoke, his voice small. Dad, do you ever get scared about my heart? James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Lying to Jacob had never been an option, but the truth here felt too heavy to hand to a 7-year-old. He split the difference. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I remember that you're strong, and you're careful, and Dr. Morrison says you're doing great. So I try to focus on that instead of the scared part. Jacob considered this. Mom was scared, wasn't she, before she got really sick? James hadn't expected that. Angela's illness had taken 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and Jacob had been too young to remember most of it. But kids picked up more than you thought they did. They absorbed fear the way they absorbed everything else, and it lived in them long after the moment had passed. Yeah, James said quietly. She was scared, but she was also brave. Being scared and being brave aren't opposites. Sometimes you're both at the same time. Jacob nodded slowly, absorbing that. The lady in my drawing looks scared. James glanced over at him. The one from the building? Yeah. She looks like she's scared, but trying not to show it. Like when I have to get blood drawn, and I don't want to cry in front of the nurse. James didn't know what to say to that. Out of the mouths of children came truths that adults spent years learning to hide from. Jacob had looked at Sarah Hartwell for maybe 30 seconds in a crowded lobby and seen something James had needed weeks to piece together. They stopped for burgers on the way home because James didn't have the energy to cook and Jacob didn't complain. They ate at the kitchen table while Jacob told James about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda that his class was starting next week. After dinner, James helped him with homework, simple multiplication that Jacob breezed through, and a reading assignment that took longer because Jacob kept stopping to ask questions about why the characters in the story made the choices they made. James answered as best he could, but halfway through he realized Jacob wasn't really asking about the story. He was asking about people. About why someone would choose safety over honesty, or comfort over risk, or being alone over being hurt. Angela would have known what to say. She'd been better at this part, the emotional architecture that kids needed to navigate the world. James was good with tools and systems and things that broke in predictable ways. People were harder. People broke in ways you couldn't always see, and the fixes weren't in any manual he'd ever read. After Jacob was asleep, James sat on the back porch with a beer he wasn't drinking and looked at the yard. The apple tree Angela had planted stood in the far corner, thin and determined, still waiting to produce fruit. She'd put it in the ground 2 months before Jacob was born, back when she'd thought she had time to see it grow. The doctors had told her to stop treatment, that the pregnancy was making everything worse, that she should prioritize her own survival. She'd refused, not because she didn't understand the risk, because she'd wanted to meet her son more than she wanted the extra months the doctors couldn't guarantee anyway. Jacob existed because Angela had chosen truth over safety, had chosen the hard thing because it mattered more than the easy thing. James thought about that every time he looked at the tree. Every time Jacob asked a question, Angela would have answered better. Every time he had to make a choice between what was smart and what was right. The copper ring in his pocket felt heavier than it should. A reminder that some promises took longer to keep than others, and some people needed more time to remember why they'd held on to things in the first place. Friday morning, James got to the building at 7 and found Stephen waiting for him near the service entrance. The facilities manager looked uncomfortable, which was never a good sign. "We need to talk," Stephen said, and gestured for James to follow him to the storage room on the ground floor where they kept the spare parts and equipment that didn't fit anywhere else. Inside, surrounded by shelves of circuit breakers and HVAC filters and industrial cleaning supplies, Stephen pulled out his phone and showed James an email. The sender was someone from the executive office. The subject line read, "Contractor Protocol Review." The body of the email was 2 paragraphs of corporate language that boiled down to, "James Williams is now restricted to floors 1 through 10 unless directly supervised. Effective immediately." James handed the phone back. "Who requested this?" Stephen shook his head. "Email came from Sarah Hartwell's office, but that doesn't mean she wrote it. Could be her assistant. Could be someone else using her authority." "Richard Ashford." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "You know Richard?" "Ran into him once." "He strike you as the kind of guy who worries about contractor protocols?" "He strikes me as the kind of guy who worries about anything that threatens his control." Stephen pocketed the phone. "You step on his toes somehow?" James thought about the lobby, about Jacob, about the way Richard had looked at them like he was cataloging information for later use. Might have gotten in his line of sight. "Well, you're in someone's crosshairs now." Stephen leaned against the shelves and crossed his arms. "I can push back on this, but it's going to take time, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Board members have pull I don't have." "Don't risk your job over it," James said. "I'll work around it." But working around it meant something had shifted. Someone was paying attention to him in a way that felt organized and deliberate, and the only reason for that attention was Sarah. Either she'd asked for it, which James didn't believe, or someone else had decided James was a problem that needed managing. The rest of the day passed in a frustration of redirected work orders and wasted time. Every job above floor 10 required James to wait for a supervisor who was inevitably busy with something else. which meant standing around in hallways doing nothing while the clock ran, and Stephen's budget burned on hours that weren't producing results. By 3 in the afternoon, James had completed exactly 2 repairs that should have taken 90 minutes total, but had eaten up 6 hours because of the new protocol. He was in the service corridor on 8, packing up his tools and trying not to let the anger show on his face when his phone rang. The neighbor who ran the after-school program, Jacob, had complained of chest pains during recess and was asking for his dad. James was in the truck and moving before the call even ended. The drive across town took 12 minutes that felt like an hour. The after-school program was in the basement of a community center 2 blocks from Jacob's elementary school, and when James got there, he found his son sitting on a chair in the director's office, looking small and pale and scared in a way that made James's chest lock up. "Hey, buddy!" James crouched in front of him, hands on Jacob's knees, checking him over the way Dr. Morrison had taught him. "Where does it hurt?" Jacob pointed to the center of his chest. "Right here. It felt weird when I was running, like something was squeezing." James pulled out his phone and opened the app that tracked Jacob's heart rate. The smartwatch on Jacob's wrist synced automatically. The reading came back elevated but not dangerous, 120, which was high for sitting still but not alarming for a kid who'd just been running around. How long did it last? Maybe a minute? I sat down and it went away. James looked at the program director, a woman named Paula, who'd been running the place for 15 years and had seen enough kids with enough conditions to know when to worry and when to wait. She gave him a small nod that said she thought this was probably nothing but understood why he'd want to check anyway. "Let's get you home," James said to Jacob. "If it happens again, we'll call Dr. Morrison." In the truck, Jacob was quiet again, that same processing silence he'd had after the checkup. James didn't push. He drove carefully, keeping an eye on his son in the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that the pain was coming back. It didn't. By the time they got home, Jacob's color had returned, and he was asking about dinner, which James took as a good sign. They ate mac and cheese from a box because it was fast, and Jacob liked it, and James didn't have the bandwidth for anything more complicated. After dinner, Jacob did homework at the kitchen table while James cleaned up, and then it was bath time and pajamas and the bedtime routine that Jacob still needed, even though he was 7 and starting to think he was too old for some of it. James read to him from a book about a boy who built a robot out of junk he found in his garage. Jacob fell asleep halfway through chapter 3, his breathing evening out into the rhythm James had learned to recognize as safe. James stayed in the room longer than usual, watching his son's chest rise and fall, the heart monitor on the nightstand blinking green in the darkness. Probably fine. Probably nothing. Probably words that James hated because they left too much room for everything to go wrong. He went to bed after midnight and didn't sleep well. When he did, he dreamed about hospitals and waiting rooms and Angela telling him it was okay to be scared and brave at the same time. Saturday morning, Jacob woke up feeling fine. No chest pain, no dizziness, no complaints beyond being bored because it was the weekend and all his friends were busy. James took him to the park anyway, let him run around on the playground equipment while James sat on a bench and pretended to read emails on his phone. What he was actually doing was watching Jacob, tracking every movement, looking for any sign that the episode from yesterday was going to repeat itself. It didn't. Jacob climbed and swung and chased other kids around, with the kind of energy that came from being 7 and mostly healthy and not yet old enough to be afraid of your own body. On the drive home, Jacob asked if they could stop by the big building where James worked. He wanted to show his dad something in his drawing, some detail he'd added that needed context James didn't have. James almost said no, the building would be mostly empty on a weekend, and he didn't have a good reason to be there, but something in the way Jacob asked made him change his mind. Like this mattered. Like the drawing had become more than just construction paper and crayons. The parking garage was nearly deserted when they pulled in. James swiped his key card at the main entrance and was surprised when it worked. Apparently the weekend access restrictions were different, or someone had forgotten to update the system. They took the elevator to the lobby. Jacob clutched his folder against his chest, suddenly nervous now that they were actually here. "What did you want to show me?" James asked. Jacob opened the folder and pulled out the drawing. The woman in the suit was still there, still unsmiling, but the details around her had multiplied. The window behind her now showed a city skyline. The desk had papers and a coffee cup. And in the corner of the image, barely visible, was a small figure, a child, standing in a doorway, looking in. James felt something shift in his chest. "Who's that?" Jacob pointed to the small figure. "That's me. I wanted to see if she was okay, but I didn't know if I was allowed to go in." "Why do you think she's not okay?" "Because nobody visits her. The room's always empty except for her, and she always looks like she's waiting for something that's not coming." James crouched down so he was eye level with his son. "Jacob, how do you know any of that? You only saw her for a few minutes." Jacob shrugged, the way kids do when they know something but can't explain how. "I just do. Like how I knew Mom was sick before the doctors said she was really sick. People's faces tell you stuff if you look right." Before James could respond, the elevator doors opened across the lobby and Sarah Hartwell stepped out. She was dressed casually, jeans, a sweater, sneakers, instead of the heels she wore during the week, and she was carrying a leather bag that looked heavy with files or documents or whatever work she'd come in to do on a Saturday morning. She saw them immediately and stopped moving. For 3 seconds nobody said anything. Then Jacob stepped forward, holding out the drawing like an offering. "I drew you," he said simply. Sarah looked at the paper, then at Jacob, then at James. Her expression was doing something complicated that James couldn't read. Finally she walked over and knelt down, bringing herself to Jacob's height. "May I see it?" Jacob handed it over. Sarah studied the drawing with a focus that suggested she was seeing more than just crayon marks on construction paper. Her finger traced the outline of the small figure in the doorway. "Who's this?" "Me," Jacob said. "I wanted to check on you, but I didn't know if you wanted visitors." Sarah's throat moved like she was swallowing something difficult. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than James had ever heard it. "That's very kind of you. Not many people think to check on me." "That's because you look like you have everything," Jacob said with the blunt honesty that came from not yet learning to filter. "But my dad says sometimes people who look like they have everything are actually really lonely." Sarah glanced up at James, and for just a moment the armor she wore every day cracked open enough that he could see the person underneath. Scared and brave at the same time, holding on to something she didn't think she was allowed to want. She handed the drawing back to Jacob. "Your dad's right. And you're very observant." Jacob beamed. "He says I get that from my mom. She could always tell when people were sad." Something in Sarah's face shifted. "Your mom sounds like she was a wonderful person." She was. Jacob's voice went small. "She died when I was little, but Dad says she's still watching us." Sarah stood up slowly, and when she looked at James this time, there was something different in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding, or the beginning of both. "Mr. Williams." Her voice had found its professional tone again, but it was thinner now, like the structure underneath was starting to give. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" James nodded. He told Jacob to wait on one of the lobby benches, and Jacob went without complaint, already pulling out more paper and crayons from his folder. Sarah walked toward the far side of the lobby, near the windows that looked out over the street, and James followed. She didn't speak right away, just stood there looking out at the empty Saturday morning traffic, her arms crossed, the ring on her finger catching the light. Finally, "I didn't ask for the access restrictions. That wasn't me." James had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it helped. "I know. Richard Ashford is on the board. He's been trying to push me out since my parents died. This is his way of applying pressure. Through me. Through anything he thinks might be a weakness." She turned to face him. "He saw you with your son. He knows who I am, who I was, and he's putting pieces together that I've spent 23 years keeping separate." James waited. She was building towards something, and interrupting would only derail it. "I kept the ring because—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't make her sound weak. "Because it was the only thing I ever owned that wasn't conditional. Everything else, the house, the name, the company, all of it came with expectations. Be grateful. Be worthy. Be a Hartwell. But that ring was just mine." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she looked away like she was angry at herself for letting it show. "I don't know how to want things without measuring what they'll cost," she continued. I've been trained not to. And you showing up here being exactly who you were 23 years ago, it breaks something I spent a long time building." James's hands were in his pockets, fingers finding the second copper ring he'd made, the one he'd been carrying since the night he decided to stay. He pulled it out and held it between them. "I made this a few weeks ago," he said. "Same way I made the first one. I was going to give it to you, but I couldn't figure out if that would be kind or cruel." Sarah stared at the ring like it was something dangerous. "You want to know what I think?" James kept his voice level. "I think you already decided what matters. You decided a long time ago when you kept that ring instead of throwing it away. You just convinced yourself the decision didn't count because you were too scared to admit what it meant." Her eyes snapped to his, and for a moment he thought she might argue. Instead, she reached out and took the second ring from his palm. Her fingers brushed his brief, careful, deliberate. "I have a gala next Friday," she said quietly. "Corporate event. Board members, executives, donors. Richard will be there. If he sees you anywhere near it, he'll use it against me." James understood what she wasn't saying. This was her telling him to stay away. This was her choosing safety over truth again, and hating herself for it, but doing it anyway because the alternative was too risky, and she'd already lost too much to gamble on something that might not hold. "I understand," James said. Sarah nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the elevators without another word. The second copper ring was still in her hand. Jacob looked up from his drawing as she passed, and she gave him a small wave that he returned with his gap-toothed smile. The elevator doors closed. Sarah was gone. Jacob came over to James with his folder tucked under his arm. "Did you fix her?" he asked. James looked down at his son. "Some things can't be fixed from the outside, buddy. People have to decide to fix themselves." Jacob thought about that for a moment, then nodded like it made sense. They walked back to the truck in silence. The drawing stayed in Jacob's folder, and the first copper ring stayed on Sarah's finger, and the distance between what was true and what was safe stayed exactly where it had always been. The gala was scheduled for 7 o'clock Friday evening. James wasn't supposed to be there. Stephen had called him Thursday afternoon with an apologetic tone and a last-minute work order. The ballroom's audio-visual system needed a final check before the event. Should have been handled earlier in the week, Stephen admitted, but the AV contractor had canceled and nobody else was available on short notice. James could do it, get in and out before guests arrived, pocket some overtime, pay for the trouble. James had said yes before thinking through what it meant. By the time he realized he was walking directly into the situation Sarah had warned him about, he'd already committed. Backing out would raise questions Stephen didn't need to answer, and James had never been good at leaving problems half-fixed. He arrived at 5:30. The ballroom was on the 3rd floor, a space designed for exactly this kind of event. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Staff were setting up tables and adjusting lighting, their movements efficient and practiced. James found the AV panel behind a service door near the stage and opened it to find a mess of outdated wiring and connections that should have been replaced years ago. The problem was obvious once he traced the circuits. Someone had spliced in a patch cable without securing it properly, and the whole setup was running on a connection that would fail the moment anyone put actual load on the system. He spent 40 minutes rewiring it correctly, testing each connection, making sure the speakers and microphones would work when they needed to. By 6:15, he was done. He logged the repair, packed his tools, and headed for the service corridor. The ballroom was filling up by then. Early arrivals in suits and evening wear, carrying champagne glasses and talking in clusters near the windows. James kept to the edges, moving quickly toward the exit, trying not to draw attention. He was almost to the corridor door when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Williams." Richard Ashford stood near the bar, a glass in his hand, flanked by 2 other men in expensive suits who had the look of board members or major donors. Richard's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Didn't expect to see contractors at an executive function. James kept his voice level. "Just finished a repair. I'm leaving now." "Of course." Richard took a step closer, and the 2 men with him followed. They weren't blocking James's path exactly, but they were making it clear that leaving required walking past them. Though it's interesting how often you seem to be in places that aren't strictly necessary for your work. James felt the tension shift. This wasn't casual conversation. Richard was building towards something, and the people around them were starting to notice. A few guests had turned to watch. Staff near the stage had paused their setup. "I go where the work is," James said, "and the work brought you here tonight. To an event you weren't invited to." Richard gestured toward the ballroom entrance. "That badge you're wearing, contractor access, not guest access. Makes people wonder about security protocols, doesn't it?" One of the men beside Richard, older, silver-haired, carrying himself like someone used to being listened to, nodded thoughtfully. "It does raise questions about oversight." James understood what was happening. Richard was creating a scene, manufacturing a problem where none existed, and doing it in front of witnesses who would remember that something felt off even if they couldn't articulate what. This was strategy. This was Richard applying pressure in the most public way possible, forcing James into a position where defending himself would look like making excuses. James was about to respond when Richard reached forward, not a grab, just a casual gesture, the kind you might make adjusting someone's collar or brushing lint off a jacket and touch the edge of James's work vest. The motion dislodged something from the chest pocket. The second copper ring, the one James had been carrying since he'd made it weeks ago, fell out and hit the ballroom floor with a small, clear sound that somehow cut through all the ambient noise. It bounced once, twice, then settled near Richard's shoe. The room didn't go silent, but the quality of the noise changed. Conversations near them dropped in volume. People turned to see what had fallen, why someone had stopped moving, what was interrupting the smooth flow of the evening. Richard looked down at the ring. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He bent and picked it up, holding it between his fingers like he was examining evidence. "Someone want to explain what a repairman's personal keepsake is doing at a Hartwell gala?" The question was directed at James, but Richard was looking past him now, toward the entrance where Sarah Hartwell had just walked in. She was wearing something dark and formal, her hair down, moving with the controlled grace of someone who knew every eye in the room would track her entrance. She saw the cluster of people near the bar, saw Richard holding something small, saw James standing there with his toolbox and contractor badge looking exactly like what he was, someone who didn't belong. Her eyes found the copper ring in Richard's hand, then found James's face, then moved to her own hand, where the first ring sat on her little finger, visible to anyone who knew to look for it. James watched her face for the crack he'd seen before, that 1 second of unguarded truth. This time the surface held. She was standing in front of people whose opinions had the power to dismantle everything she'd spent a decade building, and they were all watching her. "This event is for Caldwell's staff and guests," she said, her voice exactly level. "I'll ask facilities to clarify the schedule with contractors going forward." She didn't look at James when she said it. Didn't look at the ring Richard was still holding. An assistant appeared beside James, young, efficient, wearing the kind of apologetic expression that meant he was following orders and indicated with a gesture that James's presence was no longer required. James bent and picked up his toolbox. The copper ring Richard had been holding was placed on the bar like evidence being logged. James wanted to take it back, but doing so would only make the scene worse. He followed the assistant out through the service corridor, and just before the door swung shut he heard the gala resuming. Music, voices, the clink of crystal, the smooth machinery of corporate life moving forward like nothing had happened. In the parking garage, James sat in his truck with the engine off and called the contractor agency. Told them to close out the Hartwell contract by end of week. The dispatcher asked if there was a problem. James said no. Just time to move on to the next job. She said she'd process the paperwork and have his final check ready Monday. He drove home through Friday night traffic, past restaurants and bars filling up with people who had normal jobs and normal problems. Jacob was already asleep when he got there. The neighbor had put him to bed after the after-school program. James paid her, thanked her, and stood in Jacob's doorway for a long time watching his son breathe. The heart monitor on the nightstand blinked its steady green rhythm. Probably fine. Probably nothing. Probably the best James could hope for in a world that didn't promise anything. He went to his own room and started packing. Not everything, they weren't leaving the city, but enough that he could take the next contract wherever it came from. Chicago, maybe. Atlanta. Somewhere that wasn't here, wasn't this building, wasn't the daily reminder that some promises couldn't be kept no matter how long you held on to them. The call came at 2 in the morning. James's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he grabbed it without looking at the screen, his mind already jumping to worst-case scenarios about Jacob. But the voice on the other end wasn't a doctor or a neighbor. It was Stephen. James. Sorry to call so late. There's a situation. James sat up, fully awake now. What kind of situation? Sarah Hartwell just walked out of her own gala. Like, middle of it. Just stood up from the head table and left. Boards in chaos. Margaret Anderson, she's the chairwoman. She's asking questions about what happened earlier with Richard and the contractor. James's chest tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because Margaret called me directly. Asked about your work record, how long you've been here, whether there'd been any incidents. I told her the truth. You're the best contractor we've had in years. Never missed a day. Never caused problems. But she's digging into something, and I thought you should know. James thanked him and ended the call. He lay back down but didn't sleep. His mind was running scenarios, trying to figure out what Sarah walking out meant and whether it changed anything. Probably not. Probably just delayed the inevitable. She'd made her choice at the gala the same way she'd made it every other time. Safety over truth, structure over risk, the life she'd built over the life she might have wanted. Morning came slowly. James made breakfast for Jacob, who complained about having to eat oatmeal instead of cereal, but ate it anyway. They went through the Saturday routine cartoons, homework Jacob had been avoiding all week, a trip to the grocery store because they were out of everything. Normal things, safe things. The kind of structure that kept you moving forward when standing still meant thinking too hard about what you'd lost. Jacob asked once about the lady from the building, whether she was okay. James said he didn't know, which was the truth. Jacob accepted this and went back to his homework, but the question sat in the air between them like something unfinished. Sunday morning, Jacob woke up complaining of chest pain again. Not severe, just uncomfortable. The same squeezing sensation he'd had at recess the week before. James checked his heart rate elevated but not dangerous and called Dr. Morrison's emergency line. The doctor called back within 20 minutes and asked James to bring Jacob in to the urgent care clinic they partnered with on weekends. The clinic was across town. James drove faster than he should have, Jacob strapped in the back seat looking pale and small and scared in a way that made James's hands shake on the steering wheel. They got there in 15 minutes. The nurse took them back immediately, did an EKG, ran blood work, listened to Jacob's heart with the kind of focused attention that meant she was hearing something that concerned her. Dr. Morrison showed up 40 minutes later, which meant she'd been called in on a Sunday specifically for this, which meant the situation was serious enough to warrant it. She examined Jacob herself, looked at the EKG results, reviewed the blood work. Then she pulled James aside. His heart rate's irregular, not dangerously so, but more than I'd like to see. I want to admit him overnight for observation, run a few more tests, make sure we're not missing anything. James felt the floor drop out from under him. Is it getting worse? I don't know yet. That's why I want him here, where we can monitor him properly. Most likely it's nothing stress, activity level, something temporary. But with his history, I'd rather be cautious. James nodded, because what else could he do? They admitted Jacob to the pediatric cardiology unit on the 4th floor, got him into a bed, hooked up to monitors that tracked every heartbeat and displayed it on a screen where James could see it. Jacob was trying to be brave, but his voice was small when he asked if he was going to be okay. James sat on the edge of the bed and took his son's hand. Dr. Morrison's the best. She's going to figure out what's going on and fix it. You just need to rest and let her do her job. Will you stay? I'm not going anywhere. The nurses brought a chair that converted into a makeshift bed, and James settled in for what he knew would be a long night. Jacob fell asleep around 8. Exhausted from stress and fear and the medication they'd given him to help regulate his heart rhythm. James sat in the dark watching the monitors, counting heartbeats, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in that his son would be okay. Around 10, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Just 2 words, "I'm sorry." He stared at it for a long time before he realized it was from Sarah. How she'd gotten his number he didn't know, probably through Stephen or HR or any of a dozen ways a CEO could access information. He typed a response 3 times and deleted it 3 times. Finally settled on. "He's in the hospital. Heart episode. They're monitoring him overnight." The response came immediately. "Which hospital?" James told her. Then added, "You don't need to come. We're fine." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "I know I don't need to. I want to." James set the phone down and looked at his son sleeping in the hospital bed, small and fragile, and carrying a heart that didn't work quite right through no fault of his own. Angela had made the choice to bring him into the world knowing the risks. James made the choice every day to keep him safe, to give him the best life possible despite the limitations his body imposed. And Sarah. Sarah was making a choice right now that James didn't fully understand but recognized as the kind that mattered. She arrived an hour later. James heard her voice at the nurse's station, quiet, professional, asking which room Jacob Williams was in. The nurse directed her down the hall, and Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup, looking more like the 10-year-old girl from Riverside than the CEO from the boardroom. "Is he okay?" James stood up from the chair. "They don't know yet. Irregular heartbeat. They're running tests." Sarah stepped into the room, her eyes going to Jacob, to the monitors, to the IV line running into his small arm. She looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "I'm sorry," she finally managed. "For Friday. For all of it." James kept his voice low so he wouldn't wake Jacob. "You made your choice. I get it. It was the wrong choice." She wrapped her arms around herself like she was cold. "I've been making the wrong choice for 23 years because I was too scared to make the right one. And now I'm here." She looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted. "I left the board meeting. Margaret Anderson called an emergency session Sunday morning to discuss Richard's behavior. I didn't go back. I just left." James didn't know what to say to that. Sarah walked over to the chair beside Jacob's bed and sat down, her movements careful and quiet. She looked at the boy sleeping there with an expression James couldn't quite read. "He drew me," she said quietly. "Did he tell you that?" "He showed me. He said I looked scared, that I was trying not to show it." She glanced up at James. "He's right. I've been scared my whole life. Scared of not being good enough, not being a real Hartwell, not deserving what they gave me. And when you showed up with that ring and reminded me of who I was before all that fear took over, I didn't know how to handle it." James sat down in the chair across from her. Between them, Jacob slept, his heartbeat steady on the monitor. "I kept the ring because it was the only honest thing I owned," Sarah continued. "Everything else was conditional. Be grateful, be worthy, prove you belong. But that ring was just given. No strings, no expectations. Just a 12-year-old boy who saw a girl who had nothing and made her something anyway." Her voice cracked on the last word. She looked away, blinking hard. "My parents, the Hartwells, they weren't bad people, but they were deliberate people. They had a plan for who I was supposed to become, and I spent so long trying to fit that plan that I forgot I was allowed to want something different." James thought about Angela, about the deliberate choice she'd made to keep Jacob even when it meant giving up time she didn't have, about the way some people measured their lives in safety and others measured them in truth, and how both could be valid depending on what you were trying to protect. "What do you want?" he asked. Sarah looked at Jacob, then at James. "I want to stop being scared. I want to believe that promises made by 12-year-olds matter. I want—" She paused, searching. "I want to be seen the way your son sees me, like someone who's worth checking on." Jacob stirred in his sleep, his hand moving slightly. Sarah reached out instinctively, her fingers hovering over his without touching, like she wanted to comfort him but didn't know if she was allowed. "You can touch him," James said quietly. He won't mind. Sarah's hand settled gently on Jacob's, and the boy's breathing evened out like the contact had given him permission to relax deeper into sleep. The three of them sat like that for a while, the only sound the steady beep of the heart monitor and the quiet hum of the hospital at night. Around midnight, a nurse came in to check Jacob's vitals. Everything looked stable, she said. No changes from the last check. Dr. Morrison would be by in the morning to review the overnight data and make a recommendation. Sarah thanked her, and the nurse left with instructions to press the call button if anything changed. James dozed off sometime after 1, his body giving in to exhaustion. When he woke, it was just past 3, and Sarah was still there, still sitting beside Jacob's bed, still holding his hand. She looked up when she heard James move. "You should go home," he said. "Get some sleep." "I will." "Soon." She glanced at Jacob. "He reminds me of you, the way you were at Riverside. Brave without knowing he's being brave. His mother was like that, too." Sarah nodded. "Tell me about her?" So James did. Told her about meeting Angela at a community college class neither of them wanted to be in, about how she'd made him laugh when he'd forgotten how, about the way she'd rearranged furniture and sang off-key and refused to let the cancer take away her ability to find joy in small things. Told her about the choice Angela had made to have Jacob, knowing it would accelerate everything, because meeting her son mattered more than the extra time doctors couldn't guarantee anyway. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Sarah said. She was. "And she taught me that the hardest choices are usually the ones that matter most." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Then I walked out of that board meeting because I realized I'd spent 10 years proving I belonged in that room, and the moment I actually belonged, I didn't want to be there anymore. Not if being there meant pretending you didn't matter." James felt something shift in his chest, some weight he'd been carrying without realizing it starting to lift. "Richard presented his case," Sarah continued. "Evidence of my personal entanglement with a contractor. Video from the gala, recordings from security cameras showing us talking in hallways. He laid it all out like it was proof I couldn't be trusted to run the company." "What did the board say?" "Margaret asked me if the allegations were true. I said yes. I said I'd known you when we were children, that you'd made me that ring 23 years ago, and that I'd kept it because it reminded me of who I was before I learned to be afraid of wanting things." Sarah's voice was steady now, stronger. "Then I stood up and told them I needed to step out. That they could make whatever decision they felt was right, but I wasn't going to sit there and defend caring about someone." James stared at her. "You just left?" "I just left. Walked straight out of the building, got in my car, and drove around for 2 hours trying to figure out what I'd just done. Then I got your text about Jacob, and nothing else mattered except getting here." The sun was starting to rise outside the hospital window, pale light filtering through the blinds. Jacob stirred again, his eyes opening slowly. He saw James first, then Sarah, and his face lit up with the kind of smile that didn't know how to be anything but genuine. "You came to check on me," he said to Sarah. She smiled back, and it was the first real smile James had seen on her face since the elevator. "Of course I did. Your dad said you weren't feeling well. My heart's being weird. But the doctors are fixing it." Jacob looked between them. "Are you guys friends now?" James and Sarah exchanged a glance. Then James said, "Yeah, buddy, we're friends." "Good. You both looked too sad before." Dr. Morrison arrived at 7. She reviewed the overnight monitoring data with an expression that suggested she was cautiously optimistic. Jacob's heart rate had stabilized. No more irregular rhythms, no indication of anything acute. She wanted to keep him another few hours for observation, but if everything stayed stable, he could go home that afternoon. What caused it, James asked, could be a dozen things. Growth spurt putting stress on his system, dehydration, overexertion. The murmur makes him more susceptible to these episodes, but this particular one doesn't look like it caused any damage. Dr. Morrison made a note on her tablet. "We'll schedule a follow-up for next week. Keep him hydrated. Make sure he's not pushing himself too hard physically, and call me immediately if it happens again." Relief hit James so hard he had to sit down. Jacob was going to be okay. Probably still applied it always would, but for now, okay was enough. Sarah stood up, clearly intending to leave now that the crisis had passed. But Jacob reached for her hand before she could go. "Will you come visit us sometime, when I'm not in the hospital?" Sarah looked at James. He nodded. "I'd like that," she said to Jacob. They discharged Jacob at 2 that afternoon. James carried him to the truck, even though Jacob insisted he could walk. Sarah followed them to the parking garage, and before they parted she pulled something from her pocket. The second copper ring, the one Richard had picked up at the gala. "Margaret gave this back to me this morning," she said, holding it out to James, "along with a message. Richard's been removed from the board, effective immediately. Corporate espionage and harassment." James took the ring. "Margaret did that?" "She'd been investigating him for months. Apparently he's been trying to undermine me since my parents died, and she finally had enough evidence to move against him. The gala incident gave her the excuse she needed to present it to the other board members." Sarah smiled slightly. "Turns out some promises are worth keeping, even if they take 23 years. James looked at the ring in his palm, then at Sarah, then at Jacob, watching them from the truck with his gap-toothed grin. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now I go back to the office and figure out what kind of CEO I actually want to be," Sarah said. "One who runs a company because she's supposed to, or one who runs it because she wants to build something that matters. I'm thinking the second one." "And us?" Sarah reached out and took his hand, the one holding the copper ring. "Us gets to be whatever we decide. No conditions, no expectations, just us." Jacob called from the truck. "Dad, can we get burgers on the way home?" James laughed, the sound surprising him with how genuine it felt. "Yeah, buddy, we can get burgers." Sarah squeezed his hand once, then let go. "I'll call you tomorrow, after you've both had some rest." "I'd like that." She walked to her car, and James watched her go, the way she moved lighter now, like something heavy had been set down. Jacob was singing in the truck some song from school about frogs and lily pads. The morning sun was warm on James's face. The copper ring was solid in his hand. Some promises took 23 years to keep. Some took longer. But the ones built on truth, those had a patience that outlasted every structure built to replace them. James had learned that from Angela. He just needed Sarah to learn it too. They stopped for burgers on the way home. Jacob ordered extra fries and ate them in the truck, getting ketchup on his shirt and not caring. James drove slowly, taking the long way, watching his son in the rear-view mirror, and thinking about apple trees that took years to bear fruit and hearts that kept beating despite their imperfections, and women who'd spent decades holding on to copper rings because they refused to forget what mattered. When they got home, Jacob ran inside ahead of him, already talking about showing his friends the hospital bracelet they'd let him keep. James followed more slowly, carrying the overnight bag and the discharge papers and the 2 copper rings, one worn smooth by 23 years of being carried, one still rough and new and waiting for its purpose. Inside, Jacob was already on the couch, with his crayons out, starting a new drawing. This one showed 3 people standing under a tree, a man, a woman, and a small boy between them. The woman was smiling. James sat beside him. "Who's that?" Jacob didn't look up from his drawing. "Us. The way it's supposed to be." James didn't correct him, didn't point out that supposed to be was complicated, that life rarely followed the plans you made for it, that sometimes the best you could hope for was probably, and maybe, and we'll see. Instead, he just sat there watching his son draw the future he wanted, and for the first time in 4 years, James let himself believe that wanting something might be enough to make it real. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Thank you for letting me stay last night. I forgot what it felt like to be needed instead of useful." James typed back, "You were both. Get some rest." The response came immediately. "You too. And, James, I'm keeping both rings, just so you know." He smiled and set the phone down. Outside, the afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air, and the picture of Angela on the mantel, and Jacob's drawing of a future that might actually happen if they were all brave enough to choose it. Some promises were kept in moments, others took lifetimes. The ones worth making didn't care about the timeline. They just waited, patient and true, for the people holding them to finally understand what they'd been carrying all along.